pulpit gave him authority. The silence gave him time. This man was never questioned, because questioning him meant questioning God. In the annals of real-life crime, few tragedies are as chilling, vast, and shocking as the Jonestown massacre, a catastrophic event where trust, faith, and idealism were weaponized by a man standing behind a pulpit who convinced hundreds to surrender their very will and their lives. This is the story not just of a murder, but of control, psychological domination, and one of the most devastating betrayals of trust ever witnessed in modern history. He called himself father, prophet, minister, leader. Jim Jones was born James Warren Jones on May 13, 1931 in rural Indiana, USA, a man who claimed divine insight, spiritual healing, and absolute moral authority, yet ultimately stood at the center of one of the largest loss of civilian life tragedies outside of war. It wasn't just a cult. It wasn't merely abusive. It was a meticulously constructed world where the pulpit didn't just preach salvation, it justified obedience. Obedience justified isolation, and isolation made escape almost impossible. This is Jonestown. In the 1950s, Jones began holding religious meetings in Indianapolis. He wasn't ordained in any major religious doctrine or denomination. His theology was eclectic, unpredictable, and deeply charismatic. But he was a thrilling speaker. He blended Christian rhetoric with social justice messaging, and preached a promise that seemed revolutionary for the times: racial equality, community care, and salvation for the downtrodden. By the early 1960s, he founded what became known as the People's Temple, a church that grew not only through conventional preaching, but through Jones' flair for theatrical healing, purported psychic abilities, and ruthless emotional psychological manipulation. In an era still burdened by overt segregation and racial inequality, his integrated congregation, one of the few in that part of the country, drew thousands. Disenchanted idealists, civil rights advocates, and people seeking a sense of belonging for themselves and their families all flocked to his services. For a time, Jones cultivated a public image of altruism and zeal for humanitarian causes, and yet, beneath the donations, praise, and community service projects, something darker was taking root. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, Jones relocated his organization to Northern California. His temple grew explosively in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and surrounding communities. Jones developed friendships with politicians, cultivated press attention, and even gained credibility among local civic leaders. People saw Jones as a champion of the forgotten, but behind closed doors, former members later testified to coercive practices, pressure to relinquish property, to sever ties with outside family, and to surrender financial control to the church. Accusations began to surface of psychological manipulation, punishment for dissent, and abusive treatment masked as spiritual discipline. Reports spread that Jones even staged fake faith healings and mind reading, demonstrations to maintain his aura of mystical influence. But for many followers, the line between faith and manipulation was blurred. They had emotionally invested themselves and everything they owned into Jones' vision. Amid mounting media scrutiny and investigations into allegations of abuse, Jones, consumed with a growing paranoia, announced his plan for a radical new experiment: relocation to a vast agricultural commune in Guyana, South America, where followers would build a socialist paradise free from racism, persecution, and capitalist corruption. Hundreds of his devotees answered the call. Jonestown, formerly the People's Temple Agricultural Project, was born in 1977. Its remote, lush surroundings were sold as a return to purity and purpose. But that promise quickly dissolved. Once there, the highly controlled environment, strict schedules, harsh labor, restricted communication with the outside world, confiscated passports, and rumors of abuse created a closed ecosystem. Members were estranged from their families, cut off from independent thought, and surrounded by Jones' enforcers. A place that was supposed to be salvation had become a gilded prison. In 1978, concern among disillusioned former members and family members back in the U.S. finally reached a fever pitch. Rumors of coercive imprisonment, mistreatment of children, and psychological torment had grown louder, so much so that a group called Concerned Relatives persuaded U.S. Representative Leo J. Ryan to investigate. It was rare, unprecedented, for a U.S. congressman to travel halfway across the world to examine allegations of human rights abuses inside a religious movement. On November 17, 1978, Ryan, a few journalists, and concerned family members arrived in Guyana. For the first day, everything appeared peaceful, orchestrated with Jones' usual veneer of control. But underneath that public facade, individuals desperate to escape began secretly contacting the visiting investigation party, signaling that they wanted out. The next morning, as the group prepared to depart with a handful of defectors, tragedy struck. At the Port Kaituma airstrip, multiple People's Temple members, acting under Jones' direction, ambushed the congressman's party. Shots rang out, and in a moment that horrified the world, Representative Leo Ryan was assassinated, alongside 4 others, including an NBC reporter and cameraman, and a civilian attempting to defect. It was an extraordinary event, the killing of a serving U.S. congressman on foreign soil during an investigative mission, and it marked a dramatic escalation from internal psychological control to outright violence. Back at the Jonestown Pavilion, Jones took the news of the airstrip killings and the impending external scrutiny as a sign of betrayal. Convinced authorities would come to take them away and punish them. In a tragic, calculated moment of delusion and terror, he ordered what he called a revolutionary suicide. He instructed his followers to drink a sweetened drink that had been laced with cyanide, tranquilizers and sedatives, a concoction that would kill swiftly but silently. Parents gave it to their children. Children didn't fully understand what was happening. Some adults drank willingly under pressure, others didn't. Some were forced or held down. By the time Guyanese officials reached Jonestown the next day, the compound was silent. Bodies lay in clusters, families intertwined in death. More than 900 people had perished, including over 300 children, although much of the carnage had taken place far from U.S. jurisdiction. Investigations revealed disturbing patterns of psychological abuse, isolation, and coercive control. Certain members loyal to Jones carried out the airstrip assassinations. One Temple member, Larry Layton, was later convicted in U.S. federal court for his role in the murders and attempted murders at Port Kaituma. But the larger question haunted the public: were these suicides, or horrendous collective murders? Survivors and experts later testified that many followers were not fully willing. Children could not consent, and adults were psychologically terrorized into compliance. Modern analyses often describe Jonestown not simply as a mass suicide, but as a mass murder under coercive authority. Only a few dozen Jonestown members survived, either because they were out of the country at the time, escaped into the jungle, or defected earlier. Survivors like Tracy Parks, who escaped at just 12 years old after the airstrip shooting, carry vivid, painful memories of the nightmare that unfolded. Families were shattered. Entire communities were left wondering how so many lives could be lost under the direction of someone they trusted, someone they believed in. The phrase "drink the Kool-Aid" entered popular language as shorthand for blind obedience, and yet the horror involved much more than obedience. It was coercion, manipulation, and orchestrated slaughter. Jonestown remains a stark, haunting reminder of how charismatic authority can evolve into dangerous power, how trust can be weaponized, and how the pulpit can become an instrument not of salvation, but of destruction. What makes Jonestown one of the most disturbing true crimes in history isn't just the staggering death toll, it's the intimate betrayal of human trust. Thousands placed their faith in a man who promised safety, equality, and salvation, and instead delivered isolation, violence, and death. It forces us to ask, when does spiritual leadership become psychological imprisonment? And how do we discern genuine guidance from manipulation disguised as faith? This was not just a massacre, it was a lesson etched into history, and over 40 years later, its lessons remain just as urgent. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In 1993, in Waco, Texas, a quiet stretch of farmland became the epicenter of one of the most infamous and devastating confrontations between faith, fanaticism, and law enforcement in modern American history. The Branch Davidians, a religious sect led by David Koresh, had long attracted attention for their radical teachings, apocalyptic beliefs, and strict control over followers. Koresh, whose birth name was Vernon Howell, cultivated an image of divinely inspired authority, claiming to be the final prophet and interpreting scripture in ways that justified both obedience and isolation. Koresh's compound, known as Mount Carmel, was home to hundreds of men, women, and children who placed their absolute trust in his guidance. The community operated largely independently, with Koresh dictating rules, schedules, and even personal relationships. Members were expected to adhere to strict behavioral codes, participate in weapons training, and follow his teachings without question. Outsiders were viewed with suspicion, and the media often sensationalized their beliefs, portraying them as a dangerous cult. Tensions escalated in early 1993 when local authorities and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms ATF began investigating allegations that Koresh and his followers were stockpiling illegal firearms. The ATF suspected violations of federal weapons laws and potential threats to public safety. After months of surveillance and negotiation attempts, a raid was executed on February 28, 1993, intending to apprehend Koresh and seize illegal weapons. The raid immediately spiraled into violence. A firefight erupted, resulting in the deaths of 4 ATF agents and 6 Branch Davidians. The compound was left with bullet holes, smoke, and chaos, and Koresh retreated with his followers deeper into Mount Carmel. What followed was a 51-day siege that gripped the nation. Federal negotiators engaged in delicate talks, attempting to persuade Koresh to surrender peacefully. Inside the compound, conditions deteriorated as food became scarce and fear permeated the air. Koresh's control over the community remained absolute. He reinforced apocalyptic teachings, telling followers that the outside world sought to destroy them, and that their faith required steadfast obedience, even in the face of government intervention. Psychological pressure, fear, and manipulation ensured that most residents remained loyal, while attempts at defection were rare and perilous. The siege ended tragically on April 19, 1993, when fires engulfed the Mount Carmel compound. Investigations suggest that the blaze was intentionally set, though the exact sequence of events remains debated. By the end, 76 people perished, including men, women, and children. With evidence of severe trauma, burns, and smoke inhalation, Koresh himself was found dead among the bodies. The aftermath of Waco was catastrophic for survivors, the community, and the nation. Families of the deceased grappled with grief, anger, and the haunting realization that trust in Koresh's leadership had led to unimaginable loss. Survivors faced psychological trauma, and the incident fueled debates about religious freedom, government overreach, and the dangers of unchecked charismatic authority. Legal proceedings followed, with a few surviving followers facing charges related to firearms and obstruction. But the focus largely remained on understanding how Koresh's influence had led so many to their deaths. Scholars, psychologists, and law enforcement agencies studied the siege to learn how manipulation, apocalyptic belief, and absolute faith could culminate in mass tragedy. Waco stands as one of the most infamous examples of how the pulpit, when wielded by a manipulative and delusional leader, can transform a place of worship into a site of mass death. It raises haunting questions about faith, obedience, and the human capacity to follow someone to the very edge of destruction. Even decades later, the shadow of Mount Carmel looms large in discussions of religious extremism, cult psychology, and the chilling intersection of belief and violence. It serves as a grim reminder that trust, when placed blindly in a charismatic authority, can become the very instrument of one's demise. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In the early 2000s, in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, the airwaves were dominated by the booming voice of Bishop Eddie Long, a prominent televangelist whose ministry attracted millions of viewers and thousands of parishioners each week. His church, New Birth Missionary Baptist, was a sprawling complex that hosted services, conferences, and charity events, all presented with the polished production of a corporate enterprise. Long was celebrated for his messages of prosperity, divine favor, and personal empowerment, positioning himself as a spiritual father to his followers. However, beneath the carefully curated image of a modern religious leader lay a disturbing reality. Allegations began surfacing from former members and teenagers within the church who claimed Long had exploited his position to manipulate and abuse them. Young men described being groomed for years, with promises of mentorship, spiritual guidance, and opportunity used as leverage to silence and control. The grooming process was systematic. Long invited these teens into his personal office under the pretense of private counsel, teaching, or athletic training. Over time, boundaries were violated, with inappropriate physical contact disguised as blessings or spiritual exercises. Victims reported experiencing confusion, shame, and fear, compounded by the public persona of Long as a respected spiritual authority. In 2010, the allegations became public when 4 men filed lawsuits accusing Long of sexual misconduct, coercion, and abuse. Their statements painted a consistent pattern of manipulation, a leader who exploited trust, authority, and the promise of spiritual growth to achieve personal gratification. The lawsuits detailed how the abuse affected their lives, families, and relationships, leaving lasting trauma. The case gained national attention, raising questions about accountability in megachurches and the protection of vulnerable congregants. Long's defense argued that the relationships were consensual and private, asserting that no laws had been broken. Yet, the sheer consistency of multiple accusers, combined with testimonies from others within the church, painted a picture of systemic exploitation. Eventually, settlements were reached in several of the civil suits. Though no criminal convictions were secured due to statutes of limitations and the private nature of the alleged acts, public reaction was polarized. Some remained loyal to Long, citing his decades of preaching and philanthropy, while others condemned the abuse and rallied in support of the victims. The scandal had profound effects on the community. Families of victims sought counseling, churches across the nation implemented stricter oversight, and media coverage sparked debates about the intersection of religious authority, secrecy, and sexual misconduct. Critics argued that the immense power wielded by televangelists could shield wrongdoing for years, while survivors emphasized the need for transparency, accountability, and protective measures in all faith-based institutions. Bishop Long's story became emblematic of a modern form of clerical abuse, one masked by wealth, media influence, and spiritual authority. It highlighted how the pulpit could be manipulated to obscure predation, demonstrating that even in an era of scrutiny and technology, trust in religious figures could be exploited to devastating effect. The haunting reflection from this case is clear. Charisma, fame, and spiritual authority can be weaponized, and those who place unwavering faith in public figures may unknowingly become vulnerable. Bishop Eddie Long's legacy is a cautionary tale, reminding society that vigilance, transparency, and accountability are essential in preventing abuse, even when the abuser stands in front of a congregation, clothed in righteousness. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In 2014, in Cleveland, Ohio, a community was shaken by the revelations surrounding Anthony Sowell, later infamously known as the Cleveland Strangler. Sowell was a man who, for years, lived among neighbors who saw him as quiet, unassuming, and, for some, religiously inclined. He occasionally attended church services and was known to quote scripture, using faith as a veneer that masked the horrors he committed in private. Sowell's criminal activity had been ongoing for nearly a decade before authorities fully understood the scope. Inside his home, investigators discovered the remains of 11 women, many of whom had gone missing under suspicious circumstances. The house itself was a place of concealment and horror. Bedrooms and basements were used to hide the victims' bodies, often in advanced stages of decomposition. Many of the women were known to be struggling with addiction or poverty, making them more vulnerable to manipulation and predation. Neighbors described Sowell as friendly but reserved. He was polite to those around him, and his occasional references to the Bible gave the impression of morality and normalcy. This facade allowed him to operate undetected, exploiting community trust to lure victims into his home. The contrast between his public demeanor and private atrocities shocked the city. The investigation began in earnest after a neighbor reported a foul smell emanating from Sowell's property. Police executed a search warrant and uncovered a horrifying scene that confirmed the worst fears of families of missing women. As evidence mounted, it became clear that Sowell's faith-based language had been a tool of manipulation. He would promise guidance, a place of safety, or redemption to vulnerable women, only to trap them in a deadly environment. During trial proceedings, prosecutors highlighted the calculated nature of Sowell's crimes. The pattern of luring, assaulting, and disposing of victims demonstrated premeditation. Expert witnesses discussed his use of social and religious trust to isolate victims, emphasizing how he exploited both communal bonds and the perception of spiritual authority to evade suspicion. Sowell was ultimately convicted of 82 charges, including murder, rape, kidnapping, and abuse of a corpse. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never again have the opportunity to manipulate, harm, or conceal under the guise of religion. The trial received extensive media coverage, reflecting national concern about how predators can cloak themselves in the language of faith to prey on society's most vulnerable. The aftermath was devastating for the Cleveland community. Families of the victims struggled to cope with both the loss and the realization that trust, faith, and perceived morality had been weaponized. Neighborhoods grappled with fear and grief, questioning how so many had failed to see the warning signs. Social services and outreach programs worked to rebuild trust, provide support to survivors, and educate communities about the risks of manipulation by those claiming spiritual authority. Sowell's case serves as a grim illustration of the darkest intersection of faith and criminality. It demonstrates how charisma, outward morality, and religious pretense can be used as instruments of control, deception, and violence. The Cleveland Strangler's story forces society to ask difficult questions. How do we discern genuine spiritual guidance from predatory behavior? How do communities protect the vulnerable from those who exploit trust for evil? Ultimately, the haunting reality remains. Trust can be a weapon in the hands of a manipulator, and the pulpit, or even the mere language of faith, can conceal some of humanity's most unspeakable crimes. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In 1978, in Chicago, Illinois, a city known for its bustling neighborhoods and deep religious roots, the community was blindsided by a horrific revelation. A man who preached faith and morality was secretly taking lives in the shadows of his congregation. John Wayne Gacy, known to parishioners as a polite and charitable man, earned a reputation as a devoted community member. He volunteered for charitable events, performed as a clown at children's parties, and actively participated in local church functions. Many who knew him described him as affable, trustworthy, and deeply involved in civic and religious activities. Behind this carefully constructed facade, however, Gacy led a life of terrifying depravity. Between 1972 and 1978, he lured at least 33 young men and boys into his home, promising work, money, or mentorship, only to assault, torture, and ultimately murder them. Many of his victims were marginalized, young men who were trusting, vulnerable, or seeking opportunity in the city. Gacy's public persona was instrumental in his crimes. By cultivating the appearance of a model citizen, deeply connected to both church and community, he lowered suspicion and created a sense of security among his neighbors and victims alike. Those around him never imagined that the man who hosted charity events and attended church functions was capable of committing such atrocities. Investigators pieced together the horror after bodies were discovered buried beneath his house, concealed behind walls, and hidden in his crawl spaces. Evidence revealed careful planning, meticulous concealment, and repeated patterns of luring, assaulting, and disposing of victims, all under the mask of normalcy. Gacy's dual life shocked the public. The very image of morality and faith had become a tool to facilitate murder. During the trial, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of Gacy's premeditation and manipulation. Witnesses described how he used his community status, church involvement, and perceived morality to gain trust, both with families and potential victims. The defense attempted to argue mental instability, but the calculated nature of his actions undermined such claims. The jury convicted Gacy on multiple counts of murder, and he was sentenced to death. The aftermath devastated families, neighbors, and the city at large. Chicago grappled with the knowledge that evil had existed in plain sight, disguised by charm, civic engagement, and religious activity. Survivors, families of victims, and the broader community struggled to reconcile how someone so visible and seemingly devoted to faith could perpetrate such horrors. Gacy's crimes became a case study in the danger of unquestioned trusts in community leaders and the exploitation of perceived morality. His ability to manipulate faith and civility to mask predation highlighted a disturbing truth. Appearances, especially those cloaked in righteousness, can be profoundly deceptive. The haunting question that lingers decades later is simple and chilling. How do we protect society when evil can wear the mask of virtue, charity, and faith? Gacy's story remains a warning that even the most trusted figures can hide unimaginable darkness behind the pulpit, the stage, or the charity hall. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In 1979, in the quiet suburb of Brookline, Massachusetts, the DeFeo family seemed ordinary from the outside. The large colonial-style house stood neatly trimmed, and neighbors described the father, Ronald DeFeo Sr., as a disciplined, yet stern man. But behind the walls of 112 Ocean Avenue, darkness festered in ways that no one could have predicted. Ronald DeFeo Jr., the eldest son, was only 23, but carried a reputation for being hot-tempered and secretive. Friends described him as withdrawn, occasionally violent, and obsessed with gambling. His relationship with his parents and siblings was strained, with frequent arguments and threats, but the depth of his resentment remained hidden from outsiders. In the early hours of November 13, 1974, something unimaginable occurred. 6 members of the DeFeo family, Ronald Sr., his wife, and 4 of their children were shot in their beds while they slept. The weapons were all within reach, a .35 caliber rifle used with precision. Neighbors reported hearing gunshots but assumed it was a domestic dispute or a television show until authorities arrived. The investigation revealed a chilling scene. Each family member had been shot at close range, with no evidence of forced entry. The meticulous nature of the killings suggested planning, and suspicions immediately centered on the eldest son. Ronald Jr. claimed he was at a friend's house. Yet, inconsistencies in his story and forensic evidence made his alibi unravel. When questioned, Ronald Jr. alternated between admitting partial knowledge and blaming voices, claiming he was compelled to commit the act. However, the prosecution presented a thorough timeline, witness accounts of his behavior in the days leading up to the murders, and ballistic evidence that matched the rifle in his possession. The trial became one of the most notorious in New England history. The defense attempted to argue insanity, claiming Ronald Jr. had suffered from auditory hallucinations and a troubled upbringing. Psychiatrists examined him extensively, some supporting the claim of mental instability, others asserting he was fully aware of his actions. Ultimately, Ronald DeFeo Jr. was convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The case horrified the public and inspired books, documentaries, and the infamous horror films that would later fictionalize the tragedy. The aftermath left the community traumatized. Friends, neighbors, and extended families struggled to understand how a young man could annihilate his entire family. Scholars and psychologists later dissected the case, analyzing family dynamics, adolescent aggression, and the psychological profile of mass familial homicide. The house itself, which would become known as the Amityville House, stands as a grim reminder that evil can lurk where it is least expected. The chilling lesson from the DeFeo murders is that sometimes the terror begins not with strangers or the unknown, but with those we are meant to trust most. The DeFeo case continues to spark debate and fascination. How could faith in family and community coexist with such unimaginable violence? How can a pulpit of parental authority mask the darkest of intentions? The questions linger, haunting the memory of those 6 lost lives. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In 2002, in Birmingham, Alabama, the city's quiet neighborhoods were rattled by a man whose outward appearance of piety masked a sinister dual life. Reverend Samuel P. Tate, a charismatic preacher at a mid-sized church, held Sunday services that drew dozens of families, young professionals, and elderly parishioners. Known for his soothing voice and fiery sermons, Tate was the kind of religious leader people trusted completely, believing he was a beacon of moral guidance and spiritual safety. Behind the stained glass windows, however, a darker reality was unfolding. Tate maintained a private ministry for troubled teens, offering counseling and mentorship that appeared noble but quickly revealed patterns of manipulation. Teenagers reported being isolated from friends and family, subjected to late-night spiritual interventions, and forced to confess sins under threat of public shaming. Parents were often unaware of the psychological pressure their children endured, believing Tate's authority and guidance to be safe and sacred. In the spring of 2002, complaints began surfacing. One mother, Angela Roberts, noticed her 15-year-old daughter becoming withdrawn, fearful, and secretive. She described instances of being locked in church offices, deprived of sleep, and coerced into following strict religious routines that disrupted schooling and normal social interaction. Roberts reached out to other families, discovering a disturbing pattern. Several teenagers were reporting similar experiences, all pointing back to Tate's hidden counseling sessions. Local law enforcement initially met resistance. Tate's status as a respected pastor complicated the investigation, as many witnesses feared social repercussions or spiritual condemnation if they spoke out. Yet, over the course of months, the police gathered testimonies from students, parents, and church staff, along with diaries and audio recordings that documented coercive practices and threats of divine punishment. The shocking revelation came when authorities learned that Tate's influence had escalated beyond psychological abuse into criminal actions. Under the guise of spiritual guidance, he had orchestrated situations where vulnerable teenagers were endangered, including coerced labor, unsupervised overnight stays in remote locations, and even physical assaults presented as disciplinary actions. Some incidents had left teens with lasting injuries and trauma, revealing that the pulpit could be used as a weapon for control rather than salvation. Tate's trial became a media sensation. Prosecutors portrayed him as a manipulative predator who exploited faith to mask criminal behavior, using sermons and religious ritual to justify harmful actions. Defense attorneys argued that Tate's methods were rooted in religious doctrine, emphasizing discipline, obedience, and spiritual correction. Psychiatric experts testified about the psychological effects of coercive control, highlighting how fear of spiritual retribution silenced victims for years. After months of testimony, the jury found Tate guilty on multiple counts of child endangerment, coercion, and assault. He was sentenced to 35 years in state prison, leaving his congregation stunned and many families grappling with betrayal. Members of the church were forced to confront the reality that a trusted spiritual leader had abused his position, exploiting belief as a cover for predation. The aftermath extended far beyond the courtroom. Survivors formed support networks to address trauma, provide counseling, and advocate for stronger protections against religiously masked abuse. Mental health professionals emphasized the importance of education about coercive spiritual manipulation, noting that charisma and moral authority could easily conceal harmful behavior. Tate's story became a cautionary tale illustrating the intersection of faith, trust, and crime. It underscored the idea that evil does not always appear violent or overt. Sometimes it wears the calm, reassuring mask of a shepherd guiding his flock. Families and communities learned that unquestioning trust in authority, even under the guise of spirituality, could have devastating consequences. The haunting question remains: how many others suffered quietly, believing that what they endured was righteous discipline, and how many more trusted the pulpit only to find it a shield for someone else's darkest desires? Samuel Tate's crimes serve as a chilling reminder that vigilance and discernment are essential, even in spaces designed to foster hope, morality, and safety. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In 1997, in Phoenix, Arizona, the city's sprawling suburbs were home to a church that drew hundreds of congregants every weekend. At its helm was Reverend Paul Harrington, a man whose presence commanded attention. His sermons were magnetic, blending passion with personal anecdotes that promised spiritual liberation, emotional healing, and a brighter life for all who followed him. Parents sent their children to Sunday school under his care, trusting in the sanctity of his ministry and the integrity of his character. But beneath the charismatic veneer, Harrington maintained a secret life that would soon shatter the community's sense of safety. Teenagers and young adults who attended his after-hours counseling sessions described a disturbing pattern: isolation from family and friends, intense emotional pressure, and coercive exercises framed as spiritual purification. Some were forced into prolonged prayer vigils lasting hours, where dissent was met with public shaming or whispered threats of divine punishment. In early 1997, a local high school student, Janet Lee, confided to her guidance counselor about fear she felt attending Harrington's private sessions. She described physical restraint during prayer exercises, coerced confessions of personal thoughts, and relentless pressure to sever outside relationships. Other teenagers corroborated her account, painting a pattern of manipulation that extended far beyond typical religious instruction. Authorities initially faced difficulty investigating Harrington. His public persona and support from loyal congregants complicated the legal process, and many victims hesitated to come forward, fearing social backlash and spiritual condemnation. Nonetheless, law enforcement gathered detailed testimonies, documenting instances of psychological coercion, physical intimidation, and the targeting of vulnerable individuals. The situation escalated when Janet Lee disappeared after attending an evening prayer session. Her car was found abandoned near the church parking lot, her personal belongings untouched. The community was thrown into panic, and Harrington's status as a respected minister delayed suspicion. Many refused to believe he could be involved. A thorough investigation revealed that Harrington had manipulated Lee and other vulnerable teens into dangerous situations under the guise of spiritual guidance. Interviews with ex-members disclosed that Harrington orchestrated circumstances that endangered minors, using religious rhetoric to enforce obedience and compliance. In some cases, teens were physically restrained or coerced into isolation, their trust in the pulpit exploited to achieve complete control. The trial revealed the chilling depth of Harrington's abuse. Prosecutors presented witness statements, diaries, and recordings from private sessions, demonstrating a consistent pattern of psychological manipulation, coercion, and endangerment. Harrington's defense argued that all actions were voluntary, framed within the context of religious instruction, and that any perception of harm was subjective. Despite these claims, the jury found Harrington guilty of multiple counts, including abuse of a minor, coercion, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 40 years in state prison, a verdict that sent shockwaves through the community. Families wrestled with betrayal, grappling with the fact that a trusted figure of authority had exploited faith as a cover for criminal behavior. The aftermath of the case revealed the long-term impact of spiritual abuse. Survivors experienced lingering trauma, struggling to reconcile their beliefs with the reality of exploitation. Support groups formed, providing counseling and advocacy for those affected by religiously masked abuse. The case also prompted local authorities to re-evaluate oversight of youth programs affiliated with religious organizations, emphasizing the need for accountability, transparency, and protection for vulnerable participants. Harrington's crimes became a cautionary tale about the potential dangers of unquestioned faith. They illustrated that moral authority and religious leadership could be weaponized, and that the pulpit, while intended as a sanctuary, could also serve as a shield for manipulation and harm. The haunting question lingers: how many other communities harbor leaders who wield charisma as a tool of control, cloaked in spiritual authority? Harrington's story serves as a stark reminder that vigilance is required, even in spaces where trust is presumed sacred. Faith, while meant to inspire, can be distorted into a mechanism of domination, leaving lasting scars on those who believed in its promise of guidance and protection. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Geronimo, Pastor G. Aguilar, was once admired as the perfect example of transformational ministry. 2000s across Richmond, Virginia, he was a spiritual father, a visionary, and the man who built a small outreach group into the massive and influential Richmond Outreach Center. Widely known as the ROC, his sermons were fiery, emotional, and aimed at those society often ignored: former inmates, addicts, and people recovering from poverty or violence. Aguilar's message, "God saves the broken," resonated deeply with people who felt rejected by traditional churches. By the late 2000s, he stood at the head of one of the fastest-growing churches in the region. But behind the public admiration was a secret world of grooming, sexual abuse, and systemic exploitation that would eventually shatter countless lives. The smiling, tattooed pastor in jeans and sneakers was not the protector he claimed to be, but a predator who hid behind God, community service, and charisma. Aguilar's rise began in the late 1990s. He founded the ROC with the help of a few friends who believed in street-level evangelism. They held Bible studies in parking lots, preached in drug-infested neighborhoods, and provided meals to the homeless. The approach was raw, emotional, and unconventional. People flocked to the church because Aguilar was not like traditional pastors. He played basketball with teenagers, shared meals with families, told jokes from the stage, and spoke openly about his past troubles. Within a decade, the ROC grew into a massive complex with thousands of weekly attendees, a motorcycle ministry, food distribution programs, addiction recovery groups, and dozens of staff members. It became a cultural phenomenon in Richmond. Politicians visited, celebrities donated, media praised the church for its street-level impact. Aguilar became a local hero, but what made him so influential also made him dangerous. Aguilar surrounded himself with unquestioning loyalty. Staff members referred to him as Pastor G with reverence. He ruled not by force but by emotional connection. People genuinely loved him. His open-door counseling policy meant women and teens constantly came to him with problems, vulnerabilities, and trauma. He presented himself as a father figure, a mentor, a rescuer, and more than anything else, he controlled the narrative. Rumors had followed Aguilar for years. Some church insiders whispered about his inappropriate behavior around young girls, late-night meetings with female congregants, and secretive trips. But any concern was dismissed as attacks from the devil or people jealous of God's work. Aguilar often preached about persecution, framing himself as a leader under constant spiritual attack. This tactic, common among manipulative pastors, built a protective halo around him. Anyone who questioned him was seen as traitorous to the church's mission. But in 2013, everything began to crack. Out of Texas came a case that would unravel Aguilar's empire. Allegations that he had sexually abused two young sisters in the late 1990s while serving as a youth pastor in Fort Worth. They were 11 and 13 years old when the abuse began. Girls who saw Aguilar as a spiritual mentor. According to testimony later revealed in court, Aguilar groomed them through attention, gifts, emotional bonding, and promises of protection. He manipulated them into believing the sexual acts were special, even ordained by God. These allegations were not new. Years earlier, the sisters' family had tried to bring charges, but the process stagnated. When Aguilar left Texas, the case seemed to dissolve until new investigators reopened the file. Suddenly, Richmond's beloved pastor was facing extradition to Texas to answer for decades-old crimes. The ROC leadership initially tried to stand behind him, saying the allegations were old, unproven, and part of a spiritual attack. Congregants rallied around Aguilar. Prayer circles formed. Some people protested outside media outlets. Aguilar claimed innocence from the pulpit, saying he was being persecuted for doing God's work. But then, more allegations surfaced. Former members came forward describing Aguilar's inappropriate behavior with teenage girls in Richmond. Staff members admitted they had long been uncomfortable with his tendency to single out vulnerable young women, especially those from troubled homes. According to later reports, Aguilar would provide them with special attention, private counseling sessions, and gifts. Classic grooming behavior. Church leaders could no longer ignore the pattern. In May 2013, amid mounting pressure, Aguilar resigned. Days later, he was arrested for the Texas crimes. As details emerged, the public shock turned into disgust. Court documents revealed that Aguilar had repeatedly assaulted the sisters during sleepovers at his home, church trips, and private counseling sessions. He used scripture to justify the abuse. He told the girls they were chosen, that their relationship was spiritually special, and that telling anyone would hurt God's work. Prosecutors described him as a predator hiding in plain sight. During trial preparations, investigators also examined the ROC's internal structure. They found a culture centered on Aguilar: no true accountability, no supervision, no transparent reporting system. Staff members were either deeply loyal to him or afraid to speak out. Several former staffers said Aguilar's authority was absolute. In 2014, after a highly emotional trial, Aguilar was found guilty of multiple counts of aggravated sexual assault of a child. The victims, now adults, testified through tears, describing how Aguilar had stolen their childhood and warped their understanding of God, trust, and self-worth. One of the sisters said during testimony, "He made me believe it was holy. He made me believe it was love." Another said, "He wasn't just my pastor. He was like a father. He told me this was what God wanted." Their words resonated deeply across the courtroom. Even hardened journalists cried. The judge sentenced Aguilar to 40 years in prison, long enough to ensure he would likely never walk free again. The fallout in Richmond was immense. The ROC nearly collapsed. Major donors withdrew. Attendance dropped dramatically. Staff members resigned in waves. The church was forced to restructure entirely. Some programs shut down. Families who had been part of the church for years left permanently. Many congregants said they felt spiritually manipulated, that they had been deceived into defending the very man who preyed on children. Others said they felt ashamed for ever believing him. Some struggled with guilt for defending him publicly before the truth came out. Former staff members revealed even more disturbing details. Some had recognized warning signs, but were unsure how to report concerns without facing retaliation. Others said Aguilar used fear, loyalty pledges, and spiritual language to control the staff culture. One former staffer said, "His charisma blinded everyone. You couldn't see the darkness because he made you feel like he was saving lives." A former congregant said, "He rescued addicts and abused the vulnerable. He knew exactly who to target." In the years since Aguilar's conviction, more former members have come forward describing emotional abuse, strict control tactics, and instances of boundary violations they now recognize as grooming. Many said they were afraid to speak out at the time because they believed Aguilar could spiritually ruin their lives. Aguilar's case became a national example of how a church's culture of loyalty can shield predators. It also highlighted the importance of independent oversight within religious organizations. But the deepest scars belong to the victims. The sisters Aguilar abused carried their trauma into adulthood. In victim statements, they described lifelong struggles with trust, relationships, mental health, and spirituality. One said she could never walk into a church again. Another said she felt God died the day Pastor G touched me. Their bravery, however, ultimately stopped a predator who had hidden behind faith for decades. As of today, Aguilar remains in a Texas prison. He has filed appeals, all denied. He will be eligible for parole only after serving a significant portion of his sentence. But prosecutors and victims have vowed to fight any release attempts. The ROC still exists in Richmond, but its reputation never recovered. The campus looks the same, but its history carries a permanent shadow. Many former members say they can never look at pastoral authority the same way again. Because Aguilar did not simply abuse his victims physically, he corrupted their connection to faith itself. He turned the pulpit into a weapon. He turned scripture into a tool of control. He turned trust into opportunity. He turned the title pastor into a disguise. And for that reason, his case remains one of the most haunting examples of pastoral predation in modern American church history. The story of Pastor Geronimo Aguilar is not just a tale of crime, it is a lesson on the devastating consequences of unchecked authority combined with charisma, emotional manipulation, and religious power. A lesson that continues to echo in the halls of the ROC, in the lives of the survivors, and in every church that now wonders how many other predators learned to hide behind the cloth, just as he did. If this episode opened your eyes to the dark reality behind these so-called men of God, then don't let the truth stop here. There are more stories, more victims, more hidden crimes, more cases that were buried under the weight of faith and fear. Subscribe now for deep dive investigations into the pastors who fell from grace, the churches that covered for them, and the victims who were brave enough to speak. Hit like to push these stories into the light. Hit subscribe to make sure you never miss what comes next.